In my opinion, there's no scientific proof that says there's no soul, and there is no scientific proof that says there is no afterlife. These are all dogmatic ideas based on certain experiments. But there is the possibility for everyone to believe and hope that something like life after death does exist based on present knowledge.
Professor Kuhn, Sie sind Chefarzt.
Professor Kuhn, you are the head physician of the neurological department at Leopoldina Hospital here in Schweinfurt, and you are also a board member of the German network of near-death experiences. You have published many papers on neurological topics, and you have also extensively studied near-death experiences. There are different physiological and psychological explanations for such experiences. One explanation is simply that these experiences are hallucinations. What do you think?
Ja, Halluzinationen sind in der Medizin ja sehr bekannt.
Yes, hallucinations are very well known in medicine. It's quite common, especially in pathological conditions such as schizophrenia, psychosis, and other diseases such as Parkinson's. We know of optical hallucinations and acoustic hallucinations. These affect the senses such as seeing and hearing.
Also immer auf dem Sinnesbereich des Sehens oder des Hörens, aber es gibt auch noch andere Formen der Halluzination.
But we also know of other forms of hallucinations. The problem is that hallucinations are often regarded as something negative because they are associated with diseases. When you say something is hallucinating, it's always immediately connected with an idea. Ah, this person is imagining something. But actually, there are hallucinations that are not associated with pathological conditions. In medicine, we've known this for 50, 60, or 100 years. Roughly estimated, about 50 to 70% of all hallucinations are not pathological, such as not associated with schizophrenia and other illnesses.
Zum Beispiel können Halluzinationen auftreten beim Aufwachen.
For example, hallucinations can occur when you wake up or fall asleep. This type of hallucination is called hypnagogic or hypnopompic hallucination. Anyone can experience it. Some people experience it, but some may not. But everyone could experience it if they wanted to. These hallucinations are considered benign. But there are also a whole series of hallucinations where the cause is unknown. They may be described, but they haven't been categorized because their causes are unknown. So this was a general overview of the meaning of hallucinations. Basically, by definition, hallucinations are always defined as being not caused by a sensory stimulus. Meaning, we sense or perceive something without experiencing a sensory stimulus. That means, for example, the patient sees a dog although it's not there. So, there is no adequate sensory stimulus because he sees a dog that is not there. This is a very simple explanation of a hallucination. That's basically the overall term. And if we now apply this to near-death experiences, then near-death experiences are basically hallucinations because we have no sensory stimulus, although something is perceived, something very complex. For this reason, it is also referred to as complex hallucinations by doctors, skeptics, critics, etc. However, it must be said that the term complex hallucinations has not been standardized in medicine yet. It's just a generic term to describe something we don't really know well. So, it actually has no value yet. But, as already mentioned earlier, it is the term complex hallucinations that often provokes negative connotations.
But often near-death experiences have a very lasting effect, which influences the life of those affected in the long term. Is this effect really comparable to hallucination?
Well, it is certainly the case that hallucinations known in psychiatry, such as schizophrenia, are structured differently than hallucinations in near-death experiences. We can say from experience that in psychiatry, I am a psychiatrist as well, and in neurology, these well-known optic or acoustic hallucinations are often connected with negative experiences, negative emotions such as fear.
Oder Angst, sind angstbesetzt.
They are also not tied to any reality either. Let's take a look at acoustic hallucinations. For example, a patient reports that he is being irradiated or observed by his neighbor next door. Or it could be something else that can't be verified. These I have just given are things that occur in pathological hallucinations, but not in near-death experiences. The structure in a near-death experience is a little different. Normally, most near-death experiences are viewed as very positive. There are very few exceptions. Only about 5% are negative experiences. Most near-death experiences are very pleasant experiences, experiences of happiness, of contact with other beings, or contact with the light. And this is something very, very positive. The hallucinations in near-death experiences differ from the pathological conditions because they are structured. They are experienced as something positive and pleasant, and because they also have a completely different structure in their development. When you think about what a near-death experience entails, there are several different elements that can happen in a near-death experience. For example, an out-of-body experience. People experience encounters with the light, with deceased persons, but also with light beings, or they perceive something like transcendental worlds. These are things we don't find in pathological hallucinations, such as a sequence of events. But interestingly, near-death experiences are linked to a sequence of events. It usually begins with the out-of-body experience. Only then follows being pulled into the light, into the tunnel towards the light. This is usually a somewhat coordinated process, so to speak. Here too, we can see that there are considerable differences to pathological hallucinations. From this point of view, we have to say, purely by definition, that near-death experiences are hallucinations, but they are not the same we'd understand in medicine.
Other explanatory models assume that near-death experiences are caused by drugs produced by the body. Is this possible from your perspective?
Yes, it is true. There are indeed various clues and observations, but also studies where certain drugs can generate elements of a near-death experience. There is no drug that can generate the complete sequence of a near-death experience, but there are certain substances. I know that some time ago, about 30 or 40 years ago, near-death experiences were discussed for the first time. At that time, endorphins were always mentioned. Personally, I do not think this suggestion is correct for various reasons. When during a near-death experience a person is suddenly drawn back into his or her body, which is seriously ill, he or she suddenly feels pain again. This cannot be caused by endorphins because endorphins have a longer lasting effect and can't just stop working all of a sudden. The factor cannot be explained by endorphins, but there may be other substances that can be considered, such as dimethyltryptamine, which is caused by shamans. Dimethyltryptamine is a well-known hallucinogen, ayahuasca. There have been done researches that showed that when dimethyltryptamine was injected, the subjects experienced something similar to near-death experiences. Of course, you might wonder, how is this possible? Is this proof that something chemical changed in the body? Is it proof that this is caused exclusively by the body's internal changes, i.e. brain changes, receptor changes, etc., and that near-death experiences can be explained by this alone? This is the assumption of skeptics or critics, but I disagree. My understanding is that drugs and medications change receptors and our perception. They change the receptors in such a way that a different form of perception is possible or even partially switched off. This makes another form of perception possible. It practically isolates us from the world around us, which we usually perceive with our sensory organs. When we see, we want to know where the chair or table is, or we want to hear something. And these medications or drugs change our senses in a way so we no longer perceive the world around us as we know it. At that moment, another possible form of perception arises. that drugs can have a similar effect on the body, but this is no proof that these perceptions can only be explained from a scientific standpoint.
A heavily discussed and also controversial aspect of near-death experiences is out-of-body experience, during which a person has the sensation of stepping out of their body and looking down at themselves and their surroundings from a bird's-eye view. What explanatory models exist for this?
Out-of-body experiences are currently also the subject of research in neuropsychology and neuroscience. Raymond Moody, the discoverer and first who described near-death experiences, once said that someone who can explain an out-of-body experience can also explain near-death experience. And this statement is currently also picked up by scientists in order to find out how they could explain this phenomenon so they can say, we can explain this. This is nothing special. Therefore, near-death experience and especially out-of-body experience are just an illusion of the brain. They are also referred to as hallucinations of the brain, which cause these images. It is an image in the sense of an out-of-body perception, so that, for example, you have the feeling that you are floating in the air, or that you see your own body lying under you. In medicine, they currently explain this as a hallucination. There are indications that certain forms of out-of-body experiences can actually be traced back to hallucinations. There's some proof for that. But from my point of view, it is certainly the case that out-of-body experiences described during near-death experiences, for example, are ultimately not caused by hallucinations. Why? Because all these things, seeing one's own body, seeing the doctors and nurses as well, watching what they wear, what they say, what devices they use, all these things can't be explained by hallucinations. The key issue of the story is this. If you state this point, critics say, very well, but where is the proof? The problem is that near-death experiences are subjective accounts, which are usually not followed up because they are difficult to study. But fortunately, if you look at literature, there are about 100 cases that have already been verified, meaning that the observations of a near-death experience were very accurate. I think there's a study that has researched these verifications. In 100 cases, it was found that 90 to 95% of the observations during a near-death experience were really 100% correct. But of course, it would be desirable to have more such cases, to verify even more. But it is just very difficult to do that. Pim van Lommel, the well-known near-death researcher, pointed out that the problem is that skeptics can never be convinced by such verifications. If 1 case or 10 cases are reported, then they want to have 100 cases. And when 100 cases are reported, they want 1,000. This is just a remark. From my point of view, from a scientific point of view, we should, of course, still continue to collect more and more of these cases. And there's hope that at some point it will be convincing and that somehow it can be seen as proof.
At the center of most explanations for near-death experiences is the assumption that they are generated in some way by the brain. But is that even possible if someone is clinically dead or brain dead? Are there multiple stages of brain death?
Regarding brain death, one can say that obviously brain death does not have different stages, because if brain death really is what it is, then the brain is dead, quite frankly. But of course, there are different stages leading to brain death. I am convinced of that. During a near-death experience, neurobiological and neurological processes are actually continued. If we were to take a heart attack, for example, in most cases, evidence shows that during a heart attack, brain hypoxia occurs and oxygen levels in the brain drop within 20 to 30 seconds.
Ein Sauerstoffmangel im Gehirn entsteht, innerhalb von 20 Sekunden, 30 Sekunden nimmt der Sauerstoff im Gehirn ab.
And this also results in a flatline in the EEG. But what does that mean? It doesn't mean brain death yet. This is a clinical death, but actually it's reversible, not irreversible. Brain death would be irreversible. It has been proven in people who were close to death and survived. In a few documented cases, they regained consciousness, even though they had a flatline EEG. So the brain functions definitely shut down temporarily. This leads to a coma. It also leads to hypoxia and breathing problems, and the heart stops as well. These are the preconditions. The problem is that brain death can only be diagnosed when the functions have failed for a longer period of time. In order to do that, certain systems must be observed when determining brain death in neurology. That means two examiners have to examine the patient carefully. They also need to check if the brainstem reflexes, breathing, etc. have stopped. When there are any doubts if brain death has occurred, further examination must be performed even after 12 or 22 hours, and the doctors write very detailed reports. This long process can be circumvented by performing a special examination. Nowadays, for example, this can be done with a special ultrasound examination, which shows that the blood is no longer pulsating or no pulse. If this is the case, it is assumed that the brain has completely ceased to function. However, the well-known American researcher in critical care medicine and coma, Sam Parnia, states that an initially detected loss of brain function in the sense of brain death does not 100% mean that the brain cells have completely died. This might explain why there have been reports of some cases where the patient came back to life after 45 minutes. Of course, these are very rare exceptions. In fact, usually brain death occurs when the brain does not receive any oxygen for half an hour, and that's the maximum. So this is the common understanding. In the clinical setting, we use more practical definitions. For example, you might say that a patient is more awake, conscious, or somnolent, meaning sleepier, or soporous, which is a more advanced stage. Or the patient is in a coma, which again is another stage further. These are some rough clinical guidelines or clinical terms that we use, but in the end, it doesn't say anything about what happens inside the brain.
What do you think of the view expressed by Dutch cardiologist and near-death researcher Pim van Lommel, who, based on his studies, concluded that consciousness can evidently exist without brain functions?
First of all, from a scientific and a naturalistic point of view, we dogmatically assume that consciousness is bound to matter, and that consciousness is created by matter, meaning by cells, by the brain. That's the general concept. However, if you take a closer look, and also in the regarding literature, there is no reliable evidence for this. Scientists make assumptions how consciousness can develop. A common theory is that certain areas in the brain are activated. These areas merge via certain frequencies, and together they generate a field that creates consciousness.
Über bestimmte Bereiche zusammenschließen und dann gemeinsam kooperativ sozusagen ein Feld erzeugen, das das Bewusstsein erzeugt.
From this field, it is often possible to detect so-called gamma waves. They are high-frequency waves that go beyond normal consciousness. The daily consciousness. This field is now being associated with the creation of consciousness. However, there is no proof for this step. It is by no means certain that these gamma waves or these recorded waves actually create consciousness. They are present simultaneously and in parallel, but not always at the same time. It's by no means the case that the two are really connected. I am not a neurobiologist, but according to literature and my interpretation, it seems that gamma waves are only used to measure consciousness, because there is no other way to measure it. However, they are actually only connected with attentiveness. Thus, scientists carry out experiments whereby they increase the attentiveness of the subject. When that happens, gamma waves can be detected, but consciousness even exists if no gamma waves are detected. It must also be pointed out that it is not the case that gamma waves are always detected when there is consciousness. In my opinion, that's the big problem, that we make correlations, but eventually there is no real proof. If we go back to Pim van Lommel's thesis, I agree with him that it could be possible that consciousness exists independently of the brain. If you take the naturalistic scientific view, then it is clear that there is no life after death. There is no consciousness that survives. Therefore, it is assumed that consciousness is generated in the brain. But if you take other aspects into account, other experiences, such as reports by people, things that are otherwise ignored, such as medial contacts with the afterlife, or after-death communications, or even things that happen during the process of dying. These are things that have been described over and over again. Taking these aspects into account, the possibility arises that something may exist that goes beyond the present life, and that a certain consciousness, or consciousness as such, can live on. And if we were to consider this possibility, then we must discuss the following two options equally: the physical biological genesis and the non-physical genesis of consciousness. We should be honest and admit that neither the biological nor the other thesis can be proven. The possibilities are completely open. In my opinion, it is possible to believe in both. But if these aspects I mentioned earlier are considered, such as after-death communications, etc., then you can also argue that consciousness exists independently of the brain. And as I mentioned earlier, these drugs, dimethyltryptamines or others, can produce similar states through receptor changes. I think this is a very good example. We can think of the brain as a radio, a TV, or a computer. Consciousness or the waves are around us, and only if you set the radio or the TV to a certain frequency, you can receive them. Auf eine bestimmte Welle einstellt, dann kann man das empfangen. Und meine Vorstellung ist eben auch. And my understanding is that certain drugs, for example, or situations where near-death experiences occur, can lead to a situation where it is possible to receive these waves or other levels of consciousness or other worlds.
Another phenomenon that is close to death is the so-called terminal lucidity of mind. You've also been very interested in the aging processes, such as dementia. Do you see a connection between this phenomenon of terminal lucidity and near-death experiences?
In recent years, there have been interesting studies. Strangely enough, dying has never really been scientifically investigated, but in the last 4 or 5 years, there have been done 2 studies in the United States of America and England by Borjigin and Chawla. I don't remember the details, but one group studied about 11 or 12 dying patients. They examined dying patients with an EEG, i.e. a brainwave measurement, and an EMG, i.e. electrical muscle activity measurement. They found that shortly before death, the brainwave activity decreased, but right before death, a very strong peak occurred once more. Not in all patients, but was found in about 1/3. And this peak was associated with gamma activity, even though these patients were on the verge of death. A similar study done by Borjigin involved rats. It was done more brutally, of course. The head of the rat was cut off, decapitated, so to speak, and at that very moment, a brainwave recorded was carried out on the head. At the moment the head was off, they measured a very strong gamma activity. And this shows, if we consider the neurobiological concept of gamma activity, as I mentioned earlier, which is associated with consciousness and attentiveness, then we have to conclude that something happens before death occurs. Either this is consciousness itself, or an insane activation of attentiveness occurs at the moment of a human's or rat's death. The question is, of course, what is happening there? And nobody knows what that means, because according to conventional ideas, nothing is supposed to happen at that moment. Because if the function of cells is going down, it is not possible that something is suddenly activated again. When cells in cell cultures break down, we can see that the cells try to gather all their strength one more time. However, EEG measurements show that this is not actually the case, but that there is a steady activity that goes slowly down, and then there is a sudden peak when the graph almost reaches the bottom, when there is almost nothing left. And of course, the question arises, what does this mean? Of course, it is a near-death experience, both in the rat and in the human being. It would be very interesting to study this in more detail, but at the moment we can only speculate.
The layperson who is not influenced by naturalism could say the soul takes off.
Yes, you can certainly say that. Yes, definitely.
Could near-death experiences taken as a whole indicate that life continues after death? Many thanatologists believe that the survival hypothesis is the most plausible of all theories.
That is certainly a fundamental question that concerns everyone. In my opinion, if I think about it in more detail, it is a question of one's worldview. So it depends on what worldview a person believes in. I am sure that a skeptic or a pure naturalist will not be convinced by the whole story of near-death experiences. That's what we see all the time. On the other hand, if you take all these reports, such as personal experiences, seriously, for different reasons, we have to say that the term soul, or whatever it means, and the idea that something survives may well be justified. Of course, the question arises, is it proven? Is it not proven? But here we go into the philosophical questions. What is proof actually? What is scientific proof? If we just take a look at the history of natural sciences for a moment, then we've had a lot of proof that wasn't proof. For example, the dogma of genetics, and now there is epigenetics.
Vom Dogma der Genetik, jetzt gibt es ja die Epigenetik, es gibt ja die physikalische...
There was a dogma in physics until Einstein and Heisenberg came along, such as quantum theory and so on. There have always been ideas and proof that claim that everything is as it is. And if you want, you can see this as a message to people, to daily life, that there is hope.
Den Menschen an das tägliche Leben, dass die Hoffnung besteht, meines Erachtens.
In my opinion, there is no proof to the contrary that it can't be. There's no scientific proof that says there's no soul, and there is no scientific proof that says there is no afterlife. These are all dogmatic ideas based on certain experiments. But there is the possibility for everyone to believe and hope that something like life after death does exist, based on present knowledge.
In your opinion, what are the biggest problems of near-death experiences? What could medicine, what could therapists do better to make life easier for those affected?
Indeed, following a near-death experience, many people have to learn coping with this experience. There are also many things that could be negative during a near-death experience, but as mentioned before, 95% is positive. But the immediate reaction to it can also be negative, even though the person had a genuine experience of light or experienced something otherworldly. It may be that the person is sad and he's forced to go back to normal life now. He may be depressed because of that and so on. But most people look at it in a positive way. They see it as a wonderful experience that they'll never forget. Nevertheless, precisely because they had this experience, these people encounter problems in their daily lives because they are convinced. This is also proven in surveys that there is a life after death, that they will definitely see their deceased relatives and children again.
Verstorbenen Verwandten und Kinder vielleicht oder was auch immer wieder sieht.
This fact of transcendental experience leads to problems in daily life. Imagine somebody comes back and now she knows there is another world. That creates problems in relationships with other people. Suppose the partner did not have this experience and doubts it. This also leads to problems in marriage and even divorce because the person has changed due to the near-death experience. She has become more spiritual, more religious perhaps, and there is proof for this as well. She no longer believes in materialism. So, she is less materialistic, she appreciates other values in life. She also believes more in love, in the meaning of love in life and so on. And this, of course, leads to conflicts, not only with the spouse, but also with other people. That is a big problem. The only question is, can you help these people? One option is the Network for Near-Death Experience. One of the reasons why it was founded was to offer a contact point for these people so that they may use it. Another option would be to seek professional help such as psychotherapy if the person suffers from several problems. But it's important that the psychotherapist or counselor is familiar with near-death experiences, somebody who is familiar with it. A lot of people don't know anything about it. It should be someone who also knows the possible interpretations and is up to date with what we have just discussed, so that he or she is aware of different ways of how to interpret a patient's experience. Another option is to obtain addresses from the Network for Near-Death Experiences of therapists that they can speak to if they have problems. Of course, these problems can't always be solved, but they should give it a chance.
But the topic of near-death experiences is still not taught anywhere.
No, it's definitely not being taught. It's certainly not part of any curriculum, be it a university or school. Maybe it is addressed by different churches. There are current developments at some churches, or some groups of certain churches that are interested. There is the Catholic Church, for example. I don't know about the Protestant Church, though. I have given lectures to some Catholic congregations, for example. The priests were very interested, and the congregation was also extremely interested. There were at least 100 people there. That's an incredible number. And even if the priest said after the lecture, "I don't believe in this," I believe there will be an immediate resurrection and so on, and that the near-death experience is imagined. But I have to say, the congregation itself was more open. They no longer want to be influenced dogmatically by a certain biblical view. I noticed this because after the lecture, many people came to me for further discussions and also reported about similar experiences, even near-death experiences or elements thereof, or after-death communications. Thus, I conclude that there are people who are open, and they also admit that. They say, although I'm a member of the Catholic Church, I have my own views. I'm still religious, but of course, I don't believe everything the Catholic Church or the Protestant Church say. That's the way it is. These are subjective opinions.
Have you planned any special projects to communicate the knowledge of what happens at the verge of death more effectively?
Well, I'm still very involved as head physician of neurology here at Leopoldina Hospital in Schweinfurt. There is not enough time to work on bigger projects, but I hope that I will have more time in a year. Then I'll get more involved with the Network of Near-Death Experience. I've also thought about writing a book, but we'll have to wait and see. In any case, I think it is extremely important to give lectures and to communicate this topic, for example, by giving interviews.
Professor Kuhn, thank you for your valuable explanations. Thank you very much for this interview.
Thank you very much.